Operation Fortitude unfolded in early 1944, at the exact moment when the Allied High Command was preparing the largest amphibious invasion in history. The target was Nazi-occupied Europe. The decisive battlefield was Normandy. And yet, the most critical maneuver of this campaign would not involve soldiers crossing beaches, tanks rolling forward, or artillery firing a single shot. Instead, it involved an army that did not exist. While hundreds of thousands of Allied troops trained for the Normandy landings, the Germans were fixated on something else entirely: a massive, fully formed Allied force supposedly assembling across the English Channel, aimed directly at Pas-de-Calais. Adolf Hitler believed this force was real. The German High Command planned around it. German reserves were positioned for it. And when the real invasion began in Normandy, those reserves did not move. Why? Why did one of the most suspicious, intelligence-obsessed regimes in modern history accept the existence of an army built from inflatable tanks, wooden aircraft, fake radio traffic, and carefully staged illusions? Why did German command trust this phantom force more than the battlefield unfolding in front of them? And most disturbingly, was Operation Fortitude a triumph of strategic genius, or a reckless gamble that only succeeded because the enemy happened to look in the wrong direction at the worst possible time? Because Fortitude was not a clever trick layered on top of an invasion plan. It was a strategic wager built on fragile assumptions about human psychology, bureaucratic behavior, and how power actually makes decisions under pressure. In this episode, we will dismantle Operation Fortitude piece by piece, not to admire its creativity, but to expose the dangerous logic behind it. We will examine why this strategy should not have worked, why many commanders would never have approved it, and why its success came at a cost history often avoids discussing. This is not a story about deception as spectacle. It is a story about decision-making under uncertainty. The strategic problem facing the Allies in 1944 was brutally simple. They needed to land in Western Europe and survive long enough to establish a foothold. Normandy was vulnerable. The beaches were exposed. The initial landing forces would be fragile, stretched thin, and highly dependent on timing. If German armored reserves reached the beaches quickly, the invasion could collapse within days, or hours. The obvious solution was military superiority: land overwhelming force, destroy German defenses, and push inland before the enemy could respond. But this solution did not exist. Not in the numbers required. Not in the time available. And not against a defender who could choose when and where to counterattack. So the real question was not how to defeat German forces in Normandy. The question was how to stop them from arriving there at all. Operation Fortitude emerged as an answer to that question, but not in the way military doctrine would recommend. Instead of neutralizing German strength directly, Fortitude attempted something far more abstract and far more dangerous. It aimed to paralyze German decision-making by feeding it a version of reality that felt strategically sound. This is why Fortitude qualifies as a truly unorthodox campaign. It did not attack enemy units. It attacked enemy assumptions. It did not seek battlefield victory. It sought cognitive delay. And this is where the core tension lies. If Fortitude worked, it would buy the Allies time, perhaps just enough for Normandy to survive. If it failed, it would do the opposite. It would concentrate German forces exactly where the Allies could least afford them. There was no partial success. No graceful fallback. Either the Germans believed the illusion, or the entire invasion faced catastrophic escalation. The strategic paradox of Operation Fortitude is this: it required the Allies to commit fully to a lie, while accepting that they would never know, until the very end, whether that lie had been believed. To understand how such a strategy was even considered, we first need to understand the battlefield reality that made every conventional option unacceptable. Operation Fortitude did not emerge from creativity. It emerged from constraint. By early 1944, the Allied coalition faced a strategic landscape defined not by opportunity, but by limitation. Every option carried risk. Every delay carried cost. And every decision was shaped by forces the Allies could not fully control. On one side stood the Allies, the United States, Britain, Canada, and their partners. Their objective was clear and non-negotiable: to open a Western front in Europe. Politically, militarily, and psychologically, this was the moment the war demanded. Failure was not just a tactical setback. It would fracture alliances, embolden Germany, and prolong a war already bleeding resources and morale. On the other side stood Nazi Germany. Still dangerous. Still capable. Still possessing large, intact formations in Western Europe. Contrary to popular imagination, the Atlantic Wall was not a static relic waiting to be breached. It was part of a broader defensive system designed to absorb an initial blow and then annihilate the attacker with mobile reserves. And that is where the true battlefield was located, not on the beaches, but in the movement of German reserves. The German command structure in Western Europe revolved around a simple but powerful idea: allow the enemy to land, identify the main invasion point, then destroy it with concentrated counterattacks. This logic depended on speed. Armored divisions held back from the coast were meant to strike before the invader could consolidate. If those divisions moved quickly, Normandy would become a killing ground. If they hesitated, Normandy could survive. The Allies understood this. And they understood something else just as clearly. They could not physically prevent German reserves from moving, at least not in the early days of the invasion. Air superiority helped, but it was not decisive. Sabotage helped, but it was uneven. Naval gunfire helped, but only near the coast. The real determinant was decision time. Every hour German command delayed committing its reserves increased Allied survival odds. Every day of hesitation shifted the balance irreversibly. This created a strategic environment dominated by one question: how do you delay an enemy who is waiting for the exact moment to strike? Geography made this problem worse. Normandy was not the obvious invasion point. Pas-de-Calais was closer to England. Its ports were larger. Its beaches were more direct. From a purely logistical and geographical standpoint, Calais made more sense. German planners had believed this for years. It was the shortest crossing. The most efficient route. The place where an invasion would hurt most. Normandy, by contrast, looked like a compromise. Longer supply lines. More exposed beaches. Fewer immediate port facilities. It was viable, but only barely. This asymmetry created a dangerous imbalance. If the Germans believed Normandy was the main effort, they would react decisively. If they believed it was a diversion, they would wait. Waiting was lethal for the Allies. Time, however, was not neutral. The Allies faced severe temporal constraints. Weather windows were narrow. Tides mattered. Moonlight mattered. Postponement was not just inconvenient, it threatened the entire operational calendar. Political pressure from the Soviet Union added another layer. A second front had been promised. Delays strained trust. Meanwhile, German command was under its own pressures. Hitler's leadership style centralized authority. Field commanders lacked autonomy. Decisions flowed upward. And upward decisions took time, especially when conflicting intelligence reports arrived. This created an exploitable rigidity. But exploiting it required something unconventional. Because conventional deception would not be enough. German intelligence was not naive. It expected deception. It assumed misinformation. It filtered reports through doctrine and experience. A simple fake signal would not survive scrutiny. A single false report would be discounted. What could work, however, was consistency. If every piece of information, visual, electronic, human, reinforced the same conclusion, German command would not see deception. It would see confirmation. This is the environment in which Fortitude took shape. But before examining that strategy, it is essential to understand why the obvious military alternatives were rejected. The Allies could attempt to destroy German reserves outright through bombing. They tried. Results were mixed. Rail networks were damaged, but not paralyzed. Roads were cratered, but repaired. Armor was dispersed, hidden, preserved. They could attempt to land closer to German strength to force immediate engagement. This risked annihilation on the beaches. They could delay until overwhelming force was guaranteed. This risked losing momentum, unity, and political credibility. Each conventional option addressed the problem directly. And each failed under scrutiny. The deeper issue was structural. The Allies were strong, but not fast enough. The Germans were prepared, but uncertain. This asymmetry created a narrow window where perception mattered more than firepower. And within that window, the most dangerous variable was not German strength, but German interpretation. What the German High Command believed about Allied intentions would determine where divisions waited, where they moved, and, critically, where they did not. This transformed intelligence from a support function into a decisive battlefield. Not intelligence in the sense of secrets stolen or codes broken, but intelligence as expectation management. To succeed, the Allies would need to shape not just what the Germans knew, but how they reasoned. They would need to present a picture so internally coherent that rejecting it would feel irrational. This was not a matter of lying convincingly. It was a matter of making the truth look implausible. And that is why Operation Fortitude did not begin as a deception plan. It began as a strategic necessity born from constraint, geography, time pressure, and the limits of force. Only when every standard solution collapsed under analysis did a different idea become unavoidable. And it was precisely inside these suffocating constraints that a move, against common sense, began to look like the only remaining option. Military doctrine exists to reduce uncertainty. It codifies experience into rules, principles, and best practices so commanders can act without reinventing war each time. By 1944, amphibious warfare doctrine, hard-earned through blood in earlier campaigns, was relatively clear. To invade a defended coastline, an attacker must achieve three things as quickly as possible: overwhelming force at the point of contact, rapid expansion inland, and the neutralization of enemy reserves before they can counterattack in strength. The textbook approach to Normandy would therefore be straightforward. First, concentrate visible forces opposite the actual landing site. Second, strike hard and decisively to convince the defender that this is the main effort. Third, destroy or fix enemy reserves through air power and interdiction. Fourth, accept high initial losses in exchange for momentum. This logic was brutal, but familiar. It was how modern wars were fought. Most professional commanders would have recognized this path instantly. And many would have argued that deviation from it only increased risk. Deception, in this framework, was a supporting tool, not a foundation. It could delay. It could confuse. But it could not replace force. And this is where the problem began. Because if the Allies followed doctrine to the letter, they would lose. The concentration of forces opposite Normandy was impossible without revealing intent. The sheer scale of preparation, shipping, training, logistics, would be visible. German reconnaissance would notice. Intelligence analysts would connect the dots. Surprise would evaporate before the first landing craft hit the water. Even worse, visible concentration would trigger the very response the Allies feared most: rapid commitment of German reserves. Doctrine assumed that speed favored the attacker once contact was made. In Normandy, speed favored the defender. The beaches were narrow. Exits were limited. The initial Allied footprint would be shallow and fragile. German armor arriving early could split the landing zones, isolate units, and force a withdrawal before a coherent front formed. Doctrine also assumed that air power could neutralize enemy movement. But by 1944, German forces had adapted. They moved at night. They dispersed. They hid. Bombing slowed them, but did not stop them. In theory, the solution was to land with overwhelming superiority. In practice, the Allies did not possess such superiority at the decisive moment. This created a doctrinal contradiction. The standard approach required conditions that did not exist. And the conditions that did exist made the standard approach lethal. Faced with this contradiction, most commanders would still choose orthodoxy. Not because it guaranteed success, but because it provided accountability. If doctrine failed, responsibility could be shared. Failure would be tragic, but understandable. Unorthodox solutions offered no such protection. A strategy built on deception at scale, one that deliberately avoided demonstrating real strength, looked irresponsible by doctrinal standards. It appeared to substitute illusion for power. To many professionals, this was not boldness. It was recklessness. There was also a deeper institutional resistance. Military organizations are trained to distrust plans that cannot be tested. A conventional assault can be rehearsed, measured, adjusted. Deception cannot. You cannot wargame belief. You cannot simulate conviction. You cannot calculate how long an enemy will hesitate. Doctrine prefers levers it can pull directly. Operation Fortitude proposed something else entirely, influencing decisions indirectly, through perception and inference. This inverted the logic of control. Instead of forcing the enemy to react to actions, Fortitude required the enemy to react to expectations. Instead of removing uncertainty, it exploited it. Instead of clarity, it sought ambiguity, carefully engineered and sustained. From a doctrinal perspective, this was deeply uncomfortable. Even worse, Fortitude violated an unspoken rule of command responsibility: never base a critical operation on assumptions about the enemy's psychology unless you have no alternative. The assumptions behind Fortitude were fragile. That German command would prioritize Calais over Normandy. That Hitler would retain centralized control long enough for hesitation to matter. That intelligence channels would reinforce, not contradict, the false narrative. That field commanders would obey restraint even as real fighting erupted elsewhere. None of these were guaranteed. All could fail independently. Doctrine exists precisely to avoid such dependency chains. And yet, adherence to doctrine here produced its own paradox. If the Allies behaved exactly as doctrine recommended, they would confirm German expectations. The invasion would be detected early, classified correctly, and countered decisively. In other words, doing what made sense would make the plan fail. This is the strategic deadlock that forced a break from orthodoxy. The Allied leadership was not searching for a clever trick. They were confronting a binary choice. Accept near certain devastation by following established principles, or attempt to reshape the enemy's decision environment so those principles would not be applied correctly. Fortitude emerged not as an alternative to doctrine, but as a response to its limits. It acknowledged something doctrine rarely admits openly: that wars are not decided solely by forces in motion, but by interpretations under pressure. That command systems can be overloaded. That rational actors can be led into paralysis if given too many reasons to wait. The idea was not to deceive Germany into believing something absurd. It was to deceive Germany into believing something entirely reasonable. This distinction matters. A blatant falsehood invites scrutiny. A plausible narrative invites acceptance. Fortitude aimed for the latter. It was built to align with German strategic logic, not challenge it. This is why many commanders hesitated. They were being asked to trust a plan that depended on the enemy thinking correctly, and therefore acting incorrectly. The risk was not that the Germans would see through the deception. The risk was that they would see the truth, and choose not to believe it. In doctrinal terms, this was madness. In strategic terms, it was the only move left. Because once the Allies accepted that they could not overpower German reserves quickly, and could not hide their preparations indefinitely, the battlefield shifted from terrain to cognition. The question was no longer where to land. It was how to make the enemy misread the meaning of that landing for just long enough. And answering the question required a decision that doctrine could not authorize. That decision would fracture assumptions, divide opinions, and hinge on a set of beliefs so delicate that even its architects could not be certain they would hold. This decision did not emerge from inspiration. It emerged from friction. Operation Fortitude was not the product of a single mind or a dramatic moment of brilliance. It took shape inside a system under pressure, one where planners, intelligence officers, and senior commanders were all confronting the same conclusion from different angles: the invasion could succeed tactically and still fail strategically. Within the Allied command structure, deception was not new. It had been used before. But always as a supporting element. Never as a load-bearing pillar of a campaign this large. That distinction mattered. What Fortitude proposed was not to mask an invasion, but to redefine where the invasion was supposed to be. That shift triggered resistance immediately. From a command perspective, the objections were predictable. Some questioned feasibility. Maintaining a large-scale deception for months would require coordination across intelligence, logistics, communications, and field commands. Any inconsistency, one careless movement, one contradictory report, could unravel the entire construct. Others questioned authority. Who would control the narrative? Who decided what information was leaked, when, and through which channels? Intelligence agencies, field commanders, and political leadership did not naturally share the same priorities. But the most serious objection was philosophical. Fortitude inverted responsibility. In a conventional plan, success depended on what Allied forces did. In Fortitude, success depended on what German command believed. This transferred agency, at least temporarily, to the enemy. The Allies would act. But the decisive move would be German hesitation. Many senior officers were deeply uncomfortable with this. They understood the logic. But logic was not reassurance. Because once Fortitude began, there would be no feedback loop. No confirmation. No signal that said, the enemy has taken the bait. Silence would be the only indicator, and silence could mean many things. Despite this, the idea persisted. Not because it was elegant, but because it answered a question no other plan could: how to delay German reserves without physically stopping them. As discussions continued, Fortitude crystallized around a small number of core assumptions. These assumptions were never formally declared as such, but they underpinned every element of the plan. The first assumption was structural. German command decision-making was centralized and cautious. Major movements required approval from the top. Conflicting intelligence would slow action rather than accelerate it. Delay, in this system, was not a failure. It was a default state. Fortitude was designed to exploit that default. The second assumption was psychological. German planners believed Pas-de-Calais was the most logical invasion site. This belief was not irrational. It was reinforced by geography, logistics, and years of defensive preparation. Fortitude did not try to replace this belief. It reinforced it. Normandy would be presented not as the main effort, but as a preliminary move. A diversion. A probe meant to draw attention away from the real blow. The third assumption was institutional. German intelligence did not operate as a single, unified brain. It was fragmented. Reports came from multiple channels: signals intelligence, human sources, reconnaissance. Contradictions were expected. What mattered was which narrative survived internal filtering. Fortitude aimed to dominate that filtering process by volume and consistency. These assumptions were fragile. But they were not arbitrary. They were built from observation, pattern recognition, and an understanding of how large organizations behave under stress. Still, no assumption could be proven in advance. This is where the decision crossed from analysis into risk. Approving Fortitude meant accepting that the Allies would deliberately allow uncertainty to persist at the highest level of German command. They would resist the urge to clarify. They would maintain ambiguity even as real fighting erupted elsewhere. In effect, they would ask the enemy to explain the invasion to itself. And this required more than deception assets. It required discipline. Field commanders would have to tolerate absurdity. Inflatable tanks. Fake headquarters. Staged movements that meant nothing tactically but everything narratively. Intelligence officers would have to coordinate lies across agencies without contradiction. Political leaders would have to trust a plan whose success could not be measured until it was too late to change course. Most critically, the invasion planners would have to accept that their own forces might suffer more in the opening days, because German reserves were not being destroyed, only delayed. This was not a clever workaround. It was a calculated exposure. Fortitude did not promise safety. It promised time. And time, in Normandy, was the rarest resource. By the time the decision solidified, there was no enthusiasm, only resolve. Fortitude was accepted not because it felt right, but because every alternative felt worse. It represented a strategic acknowledgement that modern warfare was no longer only about movement and firepower. It was also about narrative coherence. About making one interpretation of events feel more convincing than another. Once that decision was made, there was no turning back. Because the moment the Allies committed to Fortitude, they committed to maintaining a lie under the most stressful conditions imaginable, when reality itself would be trying to contradict it. And the moment the first Allied soldier stepped onto the beaches of Normandy, the clock would start ticking. Not on whether the landing succeeded, but on how long the Germans would continue to believe that it didn't matter. Everything now depended on whether an illusion could survive contact with reality. Once Operation Fortitude moved from concept to execution, it entered its most dangerous phase. Planning could tolerate uncertainty. Execution could not. A deception of this scale did not function like a single trick. It functioned like a system, one that had to operate continuously, coherently, and without visible strain. The moment it appeared artificial, the illusion would collapse. The core problem was not creating false signals. It was sustaining a believable pattern of behavior. An army is not convincing because of what it owns. It is convincing because of how it behaves over time. Fortitude therefore had to simulate an entire military ecosystem. Not just equipment, but routine. Not just presence, but intent. At the center of this system was a fictional formation, the 1st U.S. Army Group. On paper, it was massive. In narrative terms, it was decisive. It was positioned opposite Pas-de-Calais and presented as the main Allied striking force. But the illusion did not rely on any single element. Physical deception played its part. Dummy tanks, fake aircraft, and fabricated encampments created visual confirmation for aerial reconnaissance. But these objects were never meant to withstand close inspection. They existed to reinforce expectations, not to deceive curiosity. The real weight of Fortitude rested elsewhere. Radio traffic became a weapon. Entire communication networks were fabricated. Messages were sent, received, repeated, and corrected, mirroring the inefficiencies of real command structures. The volume mattered as much as the content. Too little traffic suggested inactivity. Too much suggested performance. It had to feel natural. This required operators who understood not just encryption, but habit. They replicated the tempo of real units. They made mistakes deliberately. They followed routines that made sense to German signals intelligence analysts trained to detect anomalies. Human intelligence channels were equally critical. Double agents, already trusted by German intelligence, fed carefully constructed information. Not dramatic revelations. Mundane details. Troop movements. Training delays. Logistics preparations. The kind of information that felt unremarkable, and therefore reliable. Every report was designed to align with the same strategic conclusion: the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais. None of this worked in isolation. What made Fortitude function was convergence. Aerial reconnaissance saw preparations. Signals intelligence heard activity. Human sources confirmed intent. Each channel reinforced the others. And each contradiction, when it appeared, was absorbed as noise. But this convergence created its own fragility. The system had no tolerance for inconsistency. If radio traffic suggested readiness while human sources suggested delay, suspicion could arise. If dummy equipment was spotted where no communications existed, credibility would weaken. Every element had to remain synchronized under conditions of extreme operational stress. This synchronization came at a cost. Real resources were diverted to sustain fictional ones. Time, manpower, attention, commodities already in short supply, were spent maintaining an army that would never fight. Commanders had to accept inefficiency as a strategic necessity. Even more dangerous was the problem of contradictory reality. As the actual Normandy invasion approached, Allied forces began to move in earnest. Ships assembled. Troops embarked. Air activity intensified. None of this could be hidden completely. Fortitude did not aim to suppress these signals. It aimed to reinterpret them. Normandy was framed as a secondary effort. A feint. A reconnaissance in force meant to test defenses and draw attention away from the real blow to come later at Calais. This framing was not asserted loudly. It was implied quietly. And that implication had to survive contact with blood. Once Allied troops landed in Normandy, German intelligence faced a problem. The scale of the fighting did not match the idea of a mere diversion. Casualties mounted. Commitments deepened. At any moment, German command could reassess. This was the critical vulnerability. Fortitude relied on a narrow psychological window, the belief that a larger, more decisive invasion was still pending. If that belief collapsed, the entire logic of restraint collapsed with it. Inside the Allied system, this was understood. There were moments when Fortitude came close to failure. Intelligence reports hinted at German confusion. Field commanders feared that continued pressure in Normandy would force a re-evaluation. Every additional Allied division committed risked signaling intent. And yet, withdrawing was impossible. This created a paradoxical execution dynamic. The Allies had to fight hard enough in Normandy to survive, but not so decisively that the Germans concluded this had to be the main effort. They were balancing on a cognitive threshold they could not see. This is where Fortitude's true risk emerged. The plan assumed that German command would prioritize consistency over immediacy. That it would wait for confirmation rather than react instinctively. That the expectation of a second, larger invasion would override the evidence of the first. These were not tactical assumptions. They were behavioral ones. And behavioral assumptions are unforgiving. There was no mechanism to correct misinterpretation. No emergency signal that could re-anchor belief. If German command changed its mind abruptly, Fortitude could not respond in time. The deception system was powerful, but brittle. It depended on discipline at every level. One unplanned movement. One intercepted message that rang false. One captured soldier who spoke out of turn. Any of these could fracture the narrative. This is why Fortitude demanded something rare in wartime execution: restraint. Restraint from commanders eager to exploit success. Restraint from intelligence officers tempted to overplay their hand. Restraint from political leaders under pressure to demonstrate progress. Every actor had to accept delayed gratification. And all of them had to operate without knowing whether the enemy was still convinced. From the outside, Fortitude appears ingenious. From the inside, it felt like standing on a frozen lake, advancing step by step, never certain how thick the ice truly was. The illusion held, but only because reality cooperated just enough. And that cooperation was not guaranteed. Because even the most carefully constructed deception cannot control how an enemy ultimately interprets what it sees. At some point, the enemy must decide. And when that decision comes, it reveals whether the strategy was insight or luck. That moment of decision did arrive. And when it did, it exposed exactly where German command would hesitate, and why that hesitation would be fatal. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy, German command was not blind. It was conflicted. This distinction matters. The German intelligence system detected the invasion almost immediately. Reports flowed in. Coastal defenses were engaged. Field commanders understood that this was not a small raid. Real forces were landing. Real blood was being spilled. But detection is not the same as interpretation. What German command struggled with was not what was happening, but what it meant. At the strategic level, the invasion of Normandy collided head-on with an expectation that had been carefully reinforced for months: the main Allied blow would fall at Pas-de-Calais. That expectation did not disappear when the first landing craft hit the beaches. It competed. German command now faced two incompatible narratives. One narrative said, "This is the invasion." The other said, "This is the prelude." And the second narrative had structure, precedent, and logic on its side. From the German perspective, a diversionary landing made sense. Normandy lacked major ports. Supply lines would be strained. A true main effort would target a location where logistical expansion could be rapid and decisive. Calais still fit that description better than Normandy. This is where Fortitude exerted pressure, not by hiding reality, but by framing it. Every report from Normandy was filtered through an existing mental model. Losses were reinterpreted as acceptable costs of a diversion. Allied persistence was explained as necessity, not commitment. Reinforcements were seen as maintaining pressure, not escalating intent. German command did not ignore Normandy. It compartmentalized it. This compartmentalization was reinforced by structural flaws in the German decision-making system. Authority was centralized. Major redeployments required approval from the highest levels. This slowed reaction time, but more importantly, it encouraged caution. Moving reserves prematurely risked exposing Calais to the feared main invasion. Waiting felt prudent. Field commanders along the Normandy front requested reinforcements. Some argued that the scale of fighting demanded immediate response. But their assessments competed with intelligence summaries suggesting a larger threat still looming elsewhere. Conflicting inputs produced paralysis. This was not incompetence. It was organizational friction. Large hierarchical systems are designed to avoid catastrophic error by resisting sudden shifts. Fortitude exploited this design feature. The German system did exactly what it was built to do: delay irreversible decisions until certainty increased. The problem was that certainty never arrived. Instead, ambiguity persisted. Signals intelligence continued to suggest activity opposite Calais. Human sources reinforced the expectation of a second invasion. Aerial reconnaissance did not contradict this picture strongly enough to collapse it. And so German command waited. This waiting was the decisive failure. The critical error was not disbelief in Normandy. It was overbelief in Calais. German planners treated the invasion as a multi-phase event. Normandy was absorbed into Phase 1. Calais remained the decisive Phase 2. As long as Phase 2 had not occurred, committing reserves felt premature. This reveals the deepest flaw exploited by Fortitude: doctrinal rigidity under uncertainty. German command had been trained to identify the enemy Schwerpunkt, the main effort. Once identified, everything else became secondary. Fortitude prevented that identification from stabilizing. Normandy was always almost convincing, but never quite definitive. Every hour of hesitation allowed the Allies to deepen their foothold. Beachheads expanded. Supply lines stabilized. Defensive positions hardened. The very thing German reserves were meant to prevent began to take shape. Ironically, the more successful the Allied landing became, the harder it was for German command to reinterpret it quickly. Reversing an established narrative inside a rigid hierarchy is slow. It requires consensus, authority, and time. Time was exactly what the Germans no longer had. When reserves finally began to move in greater strength, the window had narrowed. Allied air power, now operating from captured territory, intensified interdiction. Roads became death traps. Movement slowed further. The delay compounded itself. At no point did German command make a single catastrophic decision. There was no dramatic blunder. No obvious moment of stupidity. The failure was systemic. They reacted logically to an information environment designed to reward caution and punish haste. They prioritized the prevention of the worst-case scenario, an invasion at Calais, over the mitigation of a scenario already unfolding. Fortitude did not force the Germans to act wrongly. It allowed them to act correctly for too long. This distinction is essential. The success of Fortitude was not built on enemy ignorance. It was built on enemy rationality constrained by structure, doctrine, and expectation. Once the Germans began to recognize that Normandy was the main effort, the strategic situation had already shifted. The Allies were no longer fragile. The beachhead had become a front. At that point, the deception no longer mattered. Fortitude had already done its work. Not by preventing reaction, but by delaying it until reaction no longer mattered. But that delay came at a cost. And understanding that cost is the only way to judge whether Fortitude was genius, or merely a gamble that happened to pay off. By the time German command began to shift its strategic posture decisively, the war in Western Europe had already entered a new phase. The beaches of Normandy were no longer a temporary foothold. They were a front. Operation Fortitude did not win the invasion. But it made the invasion survivable. The immediate result was clear. German armored reserves that could have been committed early were held back. Critical formations remained oriented toward Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an attack that never came. The window the Allies needed, measured in days, not weeks, was created. That window changed everything. Allied forces consolidated beachheads. Logistics stabilized. Airfields were secured. The fragile phase of the invasion passed. What had begun as a precarious landing evolved into sustained operations inland. From a strategic standpoint, Fortitude achieved its primary objective. It delayed decisive German counteraction at the only moment when such action could have been fatal. But this outcome hides a harsher truth. Fortitude's success did not reduce violence. It redistributed it. Because while German reserves hesitated, Allied soldiers paid the price. Normandy was not lightly defended. The fighting was brutal. Casualties mounted not because the Germans were absent, but because the Allies had chosen to absorb pressure rather than provoke full-scale counterattack elsewhere. This was the first cost. The human cost. Men were committed to beaches and hedgerows under conditions planners knew would be punishing. They fought knowing that German strength still existed nearby, but was being held back by a strategy that depended on hesitation, not destruction. Those soldiers were not protected by deception. They were exposed by it. The second cost was logistical. Fortitude required resources that produced no battlefield effect. Manpower was allocated to maintain fake units. Equipment was fabricated to be seen, not used. Communications networks were staffed to transmit messages that meant nothing tactically. In a war defined by shortages, this was not trivial. Every hour spent sustaining the illusion was an hour not spent strengthening real formations. Fortitude did not come for free. It competed directly with operational priorities. The third cost was political. If Fortitude had failed, if German command had reclassified Normandy as the main effort earlier, the fallout would have been severe. Not just militarily, but diplomatically. Trust within the Allied coalition would have fractured. Intelligence credibility would have collapsed. Responsibility would have been contested. No public narrative could have justified a plan that knowingly increased frontline risk based on assumptions about enemy psychology. This is why Fortitude was not celebrated immediately after the war. Its success was quiet. Its logic was uncomfortable. Its failure would have been catastrophic. And then there was the psychological cost, often ignored, rarely discussed. Fortitude placed extraordinary pressure on decision-makers. They committed to a strategy that offered no feedback and no correction. They watched reports from Normandy arrive without knowing whether those reports were undermining their own deception. Every German hesitation was ambiguous. Every delay could be coincidence. Every success could be temporary. This is not the pressure of battlefield command. It is the pressure of waiting. Waiting while others fight. Waiting while assumptions hold, or collapse. The planners behind Fortitude never knew, in real time, whether they were protecting the invasion or quietly endangering it. That uncertainty did not lift until the strategic balance had already shifted. And this leads to the most difficult question. If Fortitude had failed, where would the failure have come from? Not from execution. The deception system was robust. Not from enemy brilliance. German command acted rationally. Failure would have come from a broken assumption. If German leadership had decentralized authority. If field commanders had been empowered to act independently. If doctrine had favored rapid reaction over cautious validation. A small change in institutional behavior, not battlefield conditions, could have unraveled the entire strategy. This is why Fortitude cannot be reduced to a lesson in cleverness. It was a strategy that worked because the enemy behaved exactly as expected. And that is always the most dangerous condition for drawing conclusions. Because when success depends on the enemy's restraint, the margin for error is razor thin. Fortitude bought time. But it did so by spending certainty. And certainty, once spent, cannot be reclaimed. So the final question is not whether Fortitude succeeded, but what it actually proved about the nature of modern strategy, deception, and decision-making under pressure. Operation Fortitude is often remembered as a triumph of deception. That memory is incomplete. What Fortitude truly demonstrated was not how to mislead an enemy, but how to shape the conditions under which an enemy chooses not to act. This distinction matters more than the deception itself. Traditional military thinking treats intelligence as a contest of accuracy. Who knows more? Who sees clearer? Fortitude operated on a different axis. It assumed that perfect information was impossible, and instead targeted the enemy's decision-making architecture. The Germans did not fail because they lacked data. They failed because they had too much of it. Contradictory signals, layered reports, and competing interpretations flooded the system. Fortitude did not eliminate clarity. It overwhelmed it. This leads to the first strategic lesson. Fortitude did not attempt to suppress German awareness of Normandy. That would have been unrealistic. Instead, it controlled how Normandy was framed within a broader strategic narrative. Once a dominant frame is established, this is a diversion, new information is absorbed selectively. Facts do not overwrite the frame. They are interpreted through it. Modern organizations behave the same way. Decision-makers rarely ask, "What is happening?" They ask, "What does this mean within what we already believe?" If you control that belief, you control the outcome. Most doctrines focus on preventing action. Fortitude focused on slowing it. The difference is subtle but critical. Denial requires near-perfect secrecy. Delay requires plausibility. Fortitude succeeded because it did not need to be airtight. It only needed to remain believable long enough. In complex systems, delay compounds. Each postponed decision creates new constraints that make later decisions less effective. By the time action finally occurs, the context has shifted. This is why Fortitude did not need to last forever. It needed to last just long enough. Fortitude exploited hierarchy, not ignorance. German command structures centralized authority to prevent rash decisions. This was rational. It reduced the risk of overreaction. But it also increased inertia. Fortitude turned that inertia into a vulnerability. Any system optimized for caution can be defeated by speed, not speed of movement, but speed of commitment. The Allies committed early and fully to a course of action. The Germans waited for certainty. Certainty never arrived. This lesson extends far beyond warfare. Bureaucracies, corporations, and governments all share this weakness. When approval chains lengthen, windows close. Fortitude offered no immediate confirmation of success. No intercepted message said, "We believe you." No captured document validated the plan. The absence of catastrophe was the only indicator. This creates a dangerous temptation in strategy, to judge intelligence operations by outcome alone. Fortitude worked, but that does not mean it was safe. Successful deception leaves no evidence trail. Failed deception leaves a body count. This asymmetry distorts historical memory. We study fortitude because it worked. We do not study the deceptions that collapsed under scrutiny. This survivorship bias is the final lesson. Fortitude is often cited as a template. It should not be. It relied on specific enemy doctrines, leadership psychology, and institutional rigidity. Transplanted into a different context, the same approach could fail spectacularly. The real lesson is not how fortitude was executed, but why it worked. It aligned with enemy expectations. It exploited enemy structure. It leveraged enemy caution. Without those conditions, deception becomes noise. Fortitude reminds us that strategy is not about brilliance. It is about alignment. When your actions, assumptions, and enemy behavior align, even fragile plans can succeed. When they do not, even flawless execution collapses. The Allies did not outsmart the Germans in a single moment. They outlasted German certainty. And that is the most uncomfortable truth of all. Because it suggests that the most decisive victories are not won through bold action, but through the slow erosion of an opponent's willingness to decide. Operation Fortitude should not be remembered as a triumph of cleverness. It should be remembered as evidence of how fragile decision-making systems become under pressure. The most unsettling aspect of fortitude is not that the Germans were deceived. It is that they were deceived in a way that made sense. There was no collective stupidity. No obvious warning sign recklessly ignored. No single catastrophic error that later generations can comfortably mock. Every major German decision followed internal logic. Pas-de-Calais was the rational landing site. Normandy looked secondary. Holding reserves felt prudent. Waiting for confirmation appeared responsible. Fortitude did not defeat reason. It exploited reason. If fortitude had failed, history would not call it strategic genius. It would be remembered as reckless miscalculation. A massive diversion of resources. A plan built on psychological assumptions that proved false. And that is the uncomfortable truth. There was no reliable indicator, at the time, that fortitude was working. Allied commanders were trapped in the most dangerous strategic position imaginable. Committed to a plan that could not be verified until it was irreversible. This burden rarely appears in official narratives. But it defined the operation. Fortitude was unconventional not because of inflatable tanks or phantom armies. Those were tools, not the strategy. The strategy was deeper. It treated belief as the primary battlefield. It accepted controlled blindness as a feature, not a flaw. It valued delay as much as destruction. And it gambled on the assumption that the enemy would behave rationally. This is what military doctrine rarely teaches. Victory does not always come from forcing the enemy to make mistakes. Sometimes it comes from allowing them to make correct decisions for too long. Fortitude also left behind a dangerous legacy. It tempts future planners into believing deception can be engineered on demand. That perception can be reliably controlled. That adversarial systems will respond predictably to manipulation. In reality, fortitude succeeded under highly specific conditions. A rigid command structure. Leadership bias at the highest level. Strategic overload on multiple fronts. And an enemy already convinced before the deception fully took hold. Outside that context, imitation becomes hazardous. If you were a commander in 1944, with no certainty Fortitude would succeed, would you have risked the invasion of Europe on an enemy believing in something that did not exist? Answer no, and you think like most generals of the era. Answer yes, and you accept a brutal reality. You do not control outcomes. You only control probabilities. And history will only call you brilliant if you survive. Operation Fortitude is not a lesson about deception. It is a lesson about assumptions. About institutional inertia. About the cost of waiting for certainty in a world that never provides it. Wars are not always decided by what happens. Sometimes they are decided by what never does. And Fortitude prevailed. Not because it created a perfect illusion, but because it made the enemy unwilling to destroy that illusion. That is the most dangerous kind of victory.